This is going to be live and unscripted, beyond the script that I have for myself here. So a lot of really fantastic discussions going on today, and I was not here in the morning. I was watching it prior to coming in, and was really just intrigued with just some of the really interesting ideas and notions that folks are looking at around open data and open systems. It's really fantastic. So, by way of introduction, I'll start off. My name is Scott Gregory. I'm the state's Geographic Information Officer. I'm also a Deputy Director at the Department of Technology with the state of California. My interest in open data and open systems has grown dramatically over the last few years. And one thing I want to share with you before we begin to kick off into introductions and moving towards some of the questions that I want to pose to folks today, is something I wanted to share with you about where open data and open systems are going within the state. So currently, right now, there is an effort underway, sponsored through the governor's office, through this current administration, around open data. So that's great. That's great news. But what does that mean for California? California's huge, right? So we have 39 million citizens. We have a massive government. We have massive amounts of information. How do we share that in novel and interesting ways that can encourage economic development, encourage transparency, encourage the growth of the discipline, I believe, of open data, and the things that we can do and build out of that. So I wanted to share that as a context today with California kind of jumping into the fray here, and it's an exciting time. So the questions I'm going to have today are focused around open data, and also around open systems and what that means for the future of technology and analysis in California. And so some of these questions are going to be varied from business case to education and outreach to sustainability. And I think each of the panelists here have some unique expertise in that regard, and shed some light and really help direct and guide, hopefully, some of the initiatives that we enact at the state. So with that, I introduced myself. Why don't we go ahead, just for folks, I know most of you were here and saw some of our panelists speak already, but just for sake of introductions and folks that may have joined on the video cast, we'll do some quick introductions, who you are, where you're from. Go ahead.
I'm Lindsay Irving. Hi, I'm Lindsay Irving, and I worked at the California Academy of Sciences in a research lab called the Center for Applied Biodiversity Informatics, where I managed the outreach and visualization program there, and I created lots of products and media and educational programs with my collaborators for the museum audiences, and participated in national initiatives to coordinate planetarium shows for ecological literacy programs.
I'm Jennifer Schopf. No, that says locked. That's weird. Okay. I'm Jennifer Schopf. I'm the director of international networks at Indiana University right now, but I know some of you from when I was at NSF. I was one of the folks who helped figure out the NSF data management policy plan implementation. And I spoke this morning about ways to look at your data a little bit differently, to look at it beyond simply archiving, and to think about techniques in sharing.
I'm Ken. Whoa, I'm sorry about that.
Yes, you are.
Welcome.
My name is Ken Bossung. I am with Boundless, so I am with the same organization that Paul Ramsey is with. And he changed my life, too, because he was supposed to be on this panel, and he's not. So now I'm on this panel. So I've been with Boundless for 4 years. We used to be a company called OpenGeo. We're a open source geospatial software company. And I actually live right here in the area. I drove here. I live about 40 minutes away, so I'm a California resident and keenly interested in what's going on in the Delta.
And I'm Tyler Erickson. I'm a developer advocate at Google, focusing on the Earth Engine project, which is cloud-based geospatial analysis.
Great. And Ken, you have changed my life as well. So I wanted to share that. Good. Well, thank you for the introductions. And so I wanted to start off with just a broad, generalized question. And folks in the audience, think about this as well, because we're going to have an opportunity to ask questions We'll probably leave maybe the last 10 minutes, if possible, for questions for the panelists. The first question, and I'd like to see if everyone here on the panel can answer this. So, we've learned a lot today about open data, but what are some of the suggestions that folks from the panel have on how we can move forward with open data initiatives? And more specifically, what do you think is missing right now? And also, what role can government play? And I know a lot of data does come from government sources, but what can government do better to help partner in making this a more broadly acceptable initiative? So whoever would like to go first.
I've got one place. So I think one of the things that's really challenging about open data is, the first step, which is the archiving. I know when the NSF Data Management Plan came out, and Patricia Cruz mentioned this in her talk this morning as well, a lot of people were like, whoa, hey, NSF is requiring everyone put their data somewhere. NIH had previously only required this for really large projects. This is an unfunded mandate. Who's going to do this? The researcher, the library, the HPC center. I think that that's a role that the government could do better at. If you look at other countries that have done this really well, so the UK has a wonderful digital curation program. Australia does as well. The government funded national archives for their science and research projects. NSF does not do this. NSF is not going to do this. I find this, as a former NSF person, a huge disappointment. NSF looks to people, for example, the professional societies. I spent a year as an advocate at a professional society. There's no business model in it for them. Patricia this morning talked about things like PLOS, which is an open journal. But it's a pay-as-you-go by author journal. This is really difficult if you're at a smaller school, you have a smaller budget. You can't absorb the $2,000 it costs you to publish. This is actually one of the great things about California is, yes, we heard this morning, 6 of the top 20 universities are in California. California currently gets more NSF money than the bottom 30-plus states. They get more NSF money than Virginia and Ohio combined, and that's number 2 and 3. So you guys are in a really great place. I live in Indiana right now. IU's doing pretty good. A lot of our smaller schools, not so much. So I think the government could step up with basic help with archiving, or perhaps we should be looking at industry to help with this, or the Google Foundation, or other foundations like that. I know that the Sloan Foundation, for example, is very interested in data. I'd be interested to hear if you have, I don't know how much, if anything, you do with Google Foundation, but perhaps that's a place to look at.
I guess you're next.
Yeah, jump in there.
You got to pass the ball.
So I'm not sure if this is what the government could do, but definitely some thoughts on how to make data more open. And I can think of it as in 2 ways, the carrot and the stick approach first. So the first I'd go, I guess, with the stick approach. I would love to see that there is more, basically when there's proposals that are funded by government agencies, that the evaluation of the proposal, and especially when they come up for making a new proposal, is how well did they do that last step of making the data and preferably the analysis shareable so that it could be built on by others. And I don't know how, because it is a lot of work, and it's the work that usually falls off the end because they ran out of the time or something to do it, and it's hard work. It's hard to open up yourself and your data because it actually gives people the ability to scrutinize it too. But I would love to see, I guess, in a sense, funding mechanisms that say you have to do something with your data. And I think that has come from some agencies, that you have to put it into like a DAC, a data archive repository. So that's, I guess I'd like to see more of that. The other one is the carrot, the more pleasant one, the carrot approach, is that how can you reward people for opening up their data? One great example that I'm seeing, and I believe it was funded by Sloan Foundation, Moore or Sloan, I'm not sure of the foundations, but the University of California, Berkeley, University of Washington, and George Washington University, they have this data initiative to support data scientists, not just the scientists that have some very direct, like astrology or geology or something like that, but the actual building the tools to support them. And so they're going to reward the folks that are building the tools that make it possible to share. And I think that really hasn't happened in academia up to this point, that the reward structure is more as on publishing stuff, and there's actually incentive to, in some cases, not allow other people to build upon your work easily, because then you can't publish the same stuff. But I'd love to see more rewards in terms of they get funding for just doing that, making data reusable, making algorithms so somebody can actually repeat the same work that you did and then build upon it.
Great.
Just a couple quick comments, and I'll be a little bit of the advocate of the government. Why I don't know, but I think the government does a pretty good job within the confines that they can. A lot of it is policy. There's a lot of data out there, I think, more than most people are aware of, and it takes a little bit of time to dig in and search for that. But there is a lot of data that's available out there. And I can also tell you that the federal government, because we deal with them a lot, are really trying to put more and more data out. I was meeting with the CIO of NOAA about 2 weeks ago, and they want to open up more data. I think Tyler gave a great example of Landsat. It's not that they don't want to. They want to know what kind of data it is that they need to put out. I mean, the NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Foundation, posted their first little script out to GitHub about 2 weeks ago, which was a monumental undertaking. I mean, you think about it, an intelligence community of the United States federal government putting something out on GitHub. It took a long time. I spoke with the developer that actually put that out there. But they're trying. The government is trying at the federal, the state, and the local level. And so we just need to encourage them to try harder and really get the word out on what that data is that we all want to take advantage of.
Sorry. I've been attending some of these EcoHack Nights and these meetups in San Francisco, and it's really exciting because I don't have the pressures of a day-to-day job just yet, because I'm just coming out of maternity leave. So I've been going to these meetups, and it's really exciting to see creative technologists, coders, research scientists, and visualization people getting together in these little groups. And I think I met Lasse there you are. Yeah, I saw your talk a month ago for Nerds for Nature, yeah. And it was just really exciting to see these small sort of incubators of innovation. And it would be really great if maybe the government could help foster those in some way that isn't a giant NSF NOAA grant. Those things take forever to write. They're very difficult, and you rarely get them. So people like me that are touching in and the technology changes really quickly, how can we get little bits of money to put these people together from these different disciplines to do really cool work?
So let's talk a little bit about that. So how given all these it's almost like an organic development of some of these activities going on, whether it was the activity you engaged in previously or on a broader corporate level, or even at NGA, how do we, as an open data movement, how do we then sustain that movement? What are things that need to be in place that will allow us to sustain forward momentum? So it's not just, I love that slide where it was big data and medium data and small data. So it's not buzzword bingo. I mean, we all recognize it. We're all here. That's why we know why we're here is because of the power of open data and what it can do. But what are some of your thoughts on how we can sustain that approach and continue its forward momentum?
I have some quick thoughts on that, Scott. I think, let's look at the Wikipedia example and compare that to Encarta. If anyone remembers Encarta, Microsoft spent $1 billion to do what Wikipedia did. You can call it for free, but at the end of the day, it wasn't a business that was driving what occurred. It was people wanting to share information. And Paul covered a lot of that this morning, where there's a real interest that people want to collaborate. There's a real interest that people want to kind of either expose what they're working on, or work with others, and they do it on the side a lot of times. So, once things get going out there and people can, as Tyler was talking about, a lot of recognition sometimes comes from some guy over in another country taking advantage of what you've done. So, getting these things kicked off is one thing. The momentum sometimes comes because it's a great project that other people want to take advantage of.
Great.
Yeah, I think you've got a good point that was hit on by Paul this morning, as well as it needs to be part of your day job. And you had a good point about the carrot versus the stick. If you want the sustainability approach, it's got to be something that you want to do for fun. It's got to be not something that someone says, oh, you have to do this, because then it is the last thing, and then it isn't, oh, I'll get to it tomorrow, I'll get to it the next time, or you're doing a review and you're like, oh, yeah, they say I have to look at the data management plan. Hey, they have one, great, whatever. I think part of the challenge that we've been seeing is how do you get the motivation? How do you get people to want to do this? Patricia had a slide this morning with about a half a dozen reasons why people don't share their data. It's a lot of work to share your data. And actually, I'd hope to talk to Paul later because, as much as I'm an advocate for open source software and think it's a requirement for sustainable software, open source software is hard because at some point it's no longer fun. You have people using it, and that's bad. Who wants to deal with people actually using your software? If people are actually using my data, that adds work for me. So how do you give someone the motivation and the benefit? How does that become a good thing? Because that's what you need to have a sustainable approach, I think. You need to have somehow, we can always say, oh, we'll change the tenure process, more citations of your data, so that actually counts toward tenure. Well, good luck with that. But, it's there needs to be some kind of reward system.
Yeah, an incentivization of the process.
I think so.
Yeah, I agree. Any other comments on that question? I saw some hands near the microphone up front. So I thank you for those comments. And something that's interesting to me with the open data movement and also the geospatial community in the state, and they're almost one and the same in terms of their fervor and enthusiasm about the work. And oftentimes, the benefit or the forward movement from it is really intrinsic to the work that we're doing. We believe in it. We love what we do, and that's why we do it. And I think that's sort of that nudge going forward. But I do agree. I think there needs to be some type of incentive behind it and driving it, which leads me to the next question: is how do we then take it to the next step to start to define the business value of open data? That's incredibly important when we as practitioners, as scientists and academics want to approach a business process. How do we then apply open data and open systems to drive business value? Because I think when we do that, it starts to change the paradigm a little bit from this really boxed-in, myopic view of, well, we've done it this way for years and years and years, we can't do it any other way. When we open our eyes to some of the possibilities that we've all heard here today, I'd be really interested to understand, from the perspective here of the panelists, how do you drive the business value of open data and open systems?
Definitely not an expert on it. Sometimes it's hard when you just believe it intrinsically to figure out how to make the argument for it. But I think that one of the things that I mentioned during the talk, the European Space Agency, their open data policy for Copernicus, it was based on these studies of what happens, what is the cost of administering, selling the data versus actually giving it away, and then what businesses could be generated by the open data. So somebody has given it a lot of thought, and I mean that report is available. I remember finding it on the Copernicus website, the study of at least for remote sensing data, which I think about most of the time, why that is more valuable when it's given away.
Right. Okay. Ken, any thoughts on that coming from industry?
I think the example of Openstreetmap comes to mind. There's a number of businesses that are really starting to take advantage of all of the data that has been collected around Openstreetmap. So it gets back a little bit to what you were saying, Scott, is sometimes you don't really know you think about Openstreetmap, all the data that's been collected all over the world, and it's growing all the time. The data is getting more accurate. People are using it for all different kinds of. I mean, the U.S. I was in a meeting with the GIO of the U.S. Department of Transportation, and they want to take advantage of OpenStreetMap, and then they want the states to take advantage of OpenStreetMap. They think the data is getting to a point where it's highly accurate, and it will continue to get more accurate. So that's only going to drive other businesses. You can imagine in each state, people are going to start taking advantage of that data set to drive software businesses, to drive services businesses. So it's kind of an interesting example to look at, and I think that's how you can certainly derive business value from what is free and open data.
Great. Any other thoughts from the other panelists? Yeah, I would echo those same thoughts, Ken. And the idea of open data driving and being an economic development engine is incredibly powerful, and that's really one of the core tenets behind what the state is moving towards around an open data initiative. We think that there's going to be a lot of development, a lot of business development, a lot of transparency, hopefully, and a lot of sharing of important information. So, the idea of sharing data and getting information out to people and being transparent is really awfully important to what we all believe in. But there's sort of the dark side to it in terms of the areas that not a lot of people want to care about or even interact with. I'm saying on the consumer end. So when we put data out there, in a way it's accepted at face value, right? So an end user will take the data and say, I'm going to use this, and it's authoritative. I know that word sometimes makes people cringe a bit. But what are some ways in which we can begin to educate stakeholders on data, its value, how we document it, and its validity? Like what Tyler was saying in some of his discussions around ground truth data, data's data, right? But how do we begin to enrich and make it more authentic and share that vision with other people to be able to cite it properly, to use it properly, and engage the data based on its original intent? Any thoughts on how to approach that?
It sounds like you want to try to prevent another climate gate.
Perhaps.
Where I think one of the challenges that we have as scientists often is the way that we use language and the way that we talk about our data and we talk about our results don't always make sense to a lot of the lay audience. Mm-hmm. I read a really nice article about this, how we talk about climate science as a theory. Well, gravity is a theory too. We don't really talk about the opposing theories to gravity right now, and there are a lot of aspects like that. Depending on your audience, choosing your words and how you talk about things, I think, is really important. I think part of that goes into possibly a larger conversation on how to train data scientists, how to train scientists who interact with the public. One of the things that I find fascinating about government science funding right now is how there has been this huge shift over the last 10 years toward applied funding, toward away from basic research, toward funding that somehow has an impact on the greater public. And we can joke all we want about broader impacts and such, but right now it's if you can't come up with a way that your science is being used by someone other than just you probably can't get it funded. 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. This is only, I think, going to increase. And so part of what I think we need to train people as they think about things as they grow their courses, how does it impact other people? And how can you talk about it so that it's clear what you're saying and what you're not saying? When we say that there's a number of models out there, so we're not sure where the hurricane's going, that doesn't mean the models are wrong. That means there's a lot of variables and there's a lot of possibilities, and no one can predict this. There is going to be a hurricane. It is going to flood you. You do need to leave your house, regardless of the fact that we don't know if it's going to go this way, or this way.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think that's a piece of it is there's a training component and a language component to it as much as anything.
And that's exactly what we worked on with the Worldviews Network project. We worked with scientists that would interact with our science center collaborators in creating a story about environmental change. And we actually stepped back from saying this is a climate change initiative. It was about environmental change, it was about resiliency, and it's things that, you know, impact people in their neighborhoods, and how are those things connected to other trends around the world and in their regions.
Right. So, for example, in Indiana, we don't have climate change. We do have changes in the growing season.
Right.
We have changes in migratory patterns which will affect the hunting season real soon now.
Right, and that's what we had to dive into and find really good data to show that in the dome, in the immersive environment.
And this is a way, so because if I say, well, you know, we've got climate change, there's a knee-jerk reaction to, you know, you liberal nonsense. You know, I've seen this data, there's 3 papers that say it isn't. But if I say, you know, talk to me about, you know, your almond trees. Talk to me about where the, you know, you've been growing these trees here for 100 years. They're different now. There's, you know, let's not talk about who's caused it. Let's not talk about what, you know, but there's something going on that we need to be aware of. How do we need to address that? How do we need to deal with the fact that, you know, we flood in ways we didn't used to?
Right.
You know, we had over 60 inches of snow this past winter. That doesn't happen where I live now. Supposedly.
And what's great with this open data explosion is that these data sets are available. And so it was our job to try to find them, shove them into weird software platforms that they couldn't talk to, and then try to make it look like something. And what's difficult is, I think digital media literacy right now is really important for younger people and just for the general public, because we're used to seeing these big blockbuster movies that say that the world is going to end in 2012 and it's going to be so cool. And then they go to a planetarium show where we're actually using real data that's been digitized and painstakingly put together to show them the historic extent of a valley oak, you know, savanna ecosystem. And the comments are like, it's ugly. That looks like data.
Yeah.
You know, or that's not exciting. So then we bring up photos and we talk and we tell stories about it. But there's this whole pedagogy and literacy that we need to think about. And I really think bringing in other disciplines, artists, designers, coders, to help the scientists and the educators in the science centers and in all of our agencies to help make that data look like something and tell a good story around it.
Right. You just took my next question. So how do we do that? No, you didn't know, because remember, we're unscripted.
Right.
Okay, so with all this wonderful data and you know, we have scientists working on this all the time, how do we then communicate this to mom and dad or to the kids? Because really that's the impact. When data starts to touch these people's lives, then they start changing behaviors. So what are some thoughts on that? How would you do that? You had some excellent suggestions. I love this idea of collective intelligence, bringing in different disciplines to convey a specific message, whether it's a writer, an artist, a cartographer, you name it. So how do you do that?
Well, that's what we did for 3 years. We had coordinated events in a different science center across the country, where we created a planetarium show that was interactive and immersive, but our whole production process was inclusive, and we brought in advisors, and we brought in people to help us craft that story. And then we had a dialogue, a community dialogue afterwards, so that people, when we did a show about the pine bark beetle infestation and what that means, people could talk about it and debrief after seeing those visuals. And it was really exciting, except our funding only went so far. So I would say, like, having distributed interactions with the communities that are involved with that data, much like this right now.
Yeah.
But so you had 3 years of funding, which is great.
Right.
And you had a planetarium.
Right. 10 planetariums.
I don't have a planetarium near where I live now. Mm-hmm. I used to live in Washington, D.C. We have amazing museums in Washington, D.C. And Chicago, you can't beat them. I used to live walking distance to the Field Museum. I used to go down in the morning for an hour. It was great. I can't do that anymore. Most of the country can't do that anymore. So I was actually curious If you've seen anything with Google Maps and the Google Earth work in terms of outreach, how do we reach educators, for example? Are there tools there?
We have within Google a whole group called Google Earth Outreach, and they primarily focus on training nonprofits, but there are also related groups, one that formed recently as part of Outreach, that is Google GeoEDU. And the way that we've approached that is, bring folks to workshops that Google puts on the Mountain View campus and teach them the tools, kind of train the people that can train others or train the people that can influence large groups of people to try to figure out how to scale messages. And in terms of the messages we're trying to scale, we don't really care so much. It's just, there's all kinds of nonprofits that already have good messages that they're trying to share. We're just trying to help them with their own. We have worked, I guess, with the Exploratorium in San Francisco. Yep. We have a wall. I don't know how often it's up there, but actually some of the Earth Engine animations, the time lapse that I put up there earlier, that has been showing. And that's been a collaboration with a scientist from Carnegie Mellon, Randy Sargent, who's been a visiting researcher at Google, and he's way into the outreach of large data sets. He created time lapse and worked with Time Magazine on that, and now he's working with the Exploratorium. In terms of figuring out how to get the message out there, I think it actually even relates back to your earlier question. Is just I think part of the problem is that there's this feeling that there's data for a particular purpose it was created or something like that. And I guess I'd push back on that I don't think that the data creators know always the best way it can be used. And that's kind of the philosophy of a lot of these eco-hacks. It's just there's lots of creative people out there that didn't actually have a hand in creating the data. So why don't we not put a barrier into it? I mean, if they're interested, give them the information so they can actually read up on it. But I'd rather have all kinds of people misuse the data and use it for purposes. And then if enough people are doing that, the good work will bubble to the top. That's kind of the model of the internet. There's all kinds of junk out there too. But hopefully you get enough of that out there, enough people voting on it with their eyes or some other way, then you can actually get it to raise it up. And sometimes there's actually really good ways to moderate that. The GitHub idea, or there's something called Stack Overflow for answering questions. You incentivize people, they get a reputation, they put it on their resume or something like that. There's ways that you can actually incentivize people to make judgments about things, whether it's data or programming or such. Right. That are out there.
Fantastic.
I think just a quick comment on that. I mean Tyler's point is really, really great. Going back to the Openstreetmap example, when when we had the disaster in Haiti, the relief effort that took place down there, and the repository of data for that in a big way was Openstreetmap. Who would have ever thought, So that became the central hub where a lot of data was crowdsourced together for helping out with that relief effort. So much so that the State Department has now created kind of an application that I forget the name of it now, but that is up for these kinds of incidents. And when a particular incident occurs, the basis for it is Openstreetmap. So, putting out the use for the particular data set is not necessarily the greatest thing. I mean, you might not use OpenStreetMap data to navigate your car. Might not be you don't know who the authoritative data source is. Who said it's a one-way street or not, and you're going to drive your car down that based on a GPS device. Probably not the best idea, but for that particular case, it was fantastic. And the crowdsourced data that came in a very, very short period of time, the amount of it was enormous, and it was extremely helpful.
Wonderful. So I think we've run our course in time. Do we have time for a couple of questions, George, or do we? Good?
Audience?
Couple? Any questions from the audience here for our panelists? Okay, we've got a couple up front here.
Hi, I'm loud apparently. I'm Nick Santos with the UC Davis Center for Watershed Sciences, and when you were talking about sustaining a lot of these data sets, I was really curious about some of these alternative revenue models that are appearing on the internet. Things like GitTip, where people subscribe to support a developer, or nonprofits are increasingly going towards subscription revenue models. Instead of one-time donation, you become a sustaining member monthly. I'm interested in if you see those kinds of revenue models occurring with open data. Somebody says, I'm invested in this data set, please continue creating it. Is there something else that you see coming in its place?
So I haven't done this, but as was mentioned, I was a UC San Diego graduate. My advisor is Fran Berman, who's now at RPI and does a lot of work with the Research Data Alliance. And one of the models she suggests is, okay, so you paid $1 for that song you wanted to listen to on your iPhone on the way to work. Why don't you pay $1 for the data set you're downloading today? Could we come up with a small fee, not $1,000 for a publication, but $1 or $2 that even a grad student could afford, which means it's probably only $1 or $2, for these data sets? You know, is that a way to come up with a small amount of sustaining? I don't know that anybody's tried that out, but it sounds like an interesting thing to try. Part of that is you'd have to get a lot of people to do it. You know, we've seen this fail in, you know, the New York Times. I get my 10 free articles, and toward the end of the month, you know, I kind of think, okay, well, I'll wait 2 more days, and I'll read that on Monday instead, because that's the new month. But, you know, there might be a way to do that. She certainly believes in that.
To me, that would strike me as putting a barrier up in front of the data again. I mean, it's...
Even $2?
Yep.
I
Because
paid
if you
$2
wanted
for a song
to
yesterday.
download 1 million data sets of that type, I mean,
true.
back to the Landsat example, I mean, $600 is not a lot for a satellite scene if you think about what data you could potentially derive from it. But it was a barrier. I mean, it prevented research from happening. Matt Hansen said, had this one great quote in terms of doing the analysis of globally. It's just like, we used to just do research on the data we could afford, you know, to get, and now it's just like that barrier is gone from it. I could see it working. Well, I don't know if it'd work, but I could see it'd be more palatable to me as a donation type of thing if you believed in it. It's more the Wikipedia, you know. It's like if you like that, support the service. NPR maybe. But not as a requirement. It just adds an extra layer that would be getting in the way of using the data.
I think it's an interesting question, and I think that you know, at the end of the day, where's the money going to go to? That's the real question, right? So if there's an intermediary that plays a role as adding some kind of value, you know, if someone were to pay. Sorry to keep going back to Openstreetmap, but since I'm on that theme, I might as well continue. But if, you know, where would the money go for someone to download the Openstreetmap data set for the state, for the city of Davis, for example? You wouldn't put it anywhere. But if there was an organization, a company that was out there that added value on top of that someone would pay for that extra value, possibly. And that could go to perpetuate that data. They would just sit on top of it, much like open source business models, where you have communities out there. You have Hadoop, and then there's Cloudera adds value on top of that, and they build a business around that. But they continue to feed back to that open source software. Those intermediaries would continue to feed back to that open source data set, for example.
Gregory, you had another question up front?
Hi, I'm Jeannie Wong. Last month, I attended a conference on GIS and water resources, and there was a lot of conversation there on integrating open source options for a lot of the water and climate data that was available and mapping technologies. So one of the questions I had for Tyler, I've always been thinking about, is Google going to map the bathymetry, like so flow lines are not just lines, you can actually see how much water is going through. So integrating some of the data that's available nationally and internationally on bathymetry and a real DEM, a elevation data set that's going to account for water volumes. And then what open source options would be available for that, for this changing arena where you want, the flow lines is going to have a vertical projection. So
find terrain data, both topography and bathymetry, to be very interesting, just like in the talk I was talking about the snow topography changing. I can view that as a data set that is something that would feed well into like Earth Engine. We're driven by whether there's enough users to want to use it, and also the licensing of the data. And in most cases, something like you're talking about the bathymetry data, I think it is more of like, it's not all in one place, and licenses are uncertain. It's collected by individual groups. If there were places where it was all together in some forms, or like the Landsat archive or something like that, then it's more likely that we would take that and make it available to scientists. I guess I view it as just another of the environmental data sets, and we're always judging, the work that we have to do to get it into a format that makes it useful for others.
So there's water LiDAR as well. LiDAR that will penetrate.
Yep. I can repeat that, yeah.
And also what is open source
She was also pointing out that there is water penetrating LiDAR that will give you bathymetry, at least in clear waters, not turbid waters. And those data sets are available, but to my knowledge, it is very localized. It's very spotty. There's something called Open Topography that collects a lot of terrain data in the United States and distributes it. I think it's an NSF-funded group. But it's really a small percentage of the United States. And once again, if there are those data sets, there's enough of them, there's enough interest, and the license is such that it is already open. I mean, Google isn't the one that can open the license. It's basically as a rule, we don't generate a lot of the data. We make tools that people can generate content, but we're not really a hardware company for the most part. So I guess I don't have a great answer for that, other than I'm not aware of a really large volume of bathymetry data. I think there would be scientists that would be interested in it, but.
Great, and I think we had one more, if that's okay. Schopf, did you have one question?
I was just going to comment on the paying for data, even if it's a small amount, is that in a lot of organizations, and I know I'm with the federal government, you were the state, it would cost more for us to take the dollar than to give you the data.
No, so when this came up and we started talking about this, I was thinking about, I think it's Portland now doesn't charge for you to use the bus within the city, because somebody actually did the model and it turned out it was more expensive and more time consuming for them to deal with the bus fares than it was to just let everybody ride it for free. And then you had the added benefit of less cars. Fewer cars and less pollution and all these other things by making it free. So I think the models are really hard. I think when we start talking about sustaining data, someone's got to pay for it. I can tell you the professional societies look at this with, they're concerned. There is no business model for APS or, IEEE Computer Society to do massive archives. There's nothing in it for them. All it is a whole lot more work. And, so somebody's got to do something.
Well, I think that mirrors the federal government, too, is that somebody took care of it somewhere. There was a records management person that if you got FOIA, they'll go find it. I'm not sure where it is, but they'll find it, or enough to, satisfy the FOIA. But anything that any of you can do to influence...
Could you hold the microphone closer?
Oh, okay. Anything that you can do to influence the government, if you have a chance to talk about data management, they're slowly starting to get a glimmer, but right now is really the time to push, to make that a priority.
So, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think one of the challenges people have is data should be looked at as infrastructure. The same way software should be infrastructure too, but data is infrastructure the same way the library is infrastructure, the same way the plumbing is infrastructure. So it shouldn't be an add-on cost. It should be part of the core underpinnings of what we do. But we're not there yet.
Well, I think this dialogue will continue, and I hope it'll continue into this evening. I want to thank our panelists today, and I want to thank you for your attention and your great questions. And with that, we will break. Thank you again.
Scott, I think you might